I'd like to welcome back Professor of Imperial and Colonial History at Flinders University in Australia, Professor Andrekos Varnava. Professor Varnava is a prolific writer, having authored dozens of papers and edited a number of collections, in addition to writing several monographs, including British Imperialism in Cyprus, 1878 to 1915, British Cyprus in the Long Great War, 1914 to 1925, and, of course, very much relevant for this month's episode, Serving the Empire in the Great War, the Cypriot Mule Corps. Andriko, it's great to chat again.
It's great to be with you again.
Okay, so for listeners, do you mind contextualizing Cyprus's history in the early 20th century? In other words, like, what is its relation to Great Britain at this time?
Well, Cyprus came under British occupation and administration in 1878. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire, and in fact, it remained a part of the Ottoman Empire, sovereignty-wise, until 1914, when Ottomans joined the Central Powers in World War I, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But for all intents and purposes, Cyprus was a British possession. It wasn't a British colony officially, but it was effectively run like one, because from the early 1880s, it was given to the Colonial Office after a short period of control by the Foreign Office. And it's from then on that sort of its fortunes become, if you like, it takes the path that it does. Very limited development. Cyprus was just another colony, basically, if you like. So they abandoned these ideas to develop it as a military and naval base. There were a number of reasons for this. Its climate, for one. The costs were another. In 1882, the British occupied Egypt, and even though it was never meant to be permanent, they didn't give it up. So the harbour of Alexandria was all that the British really needed. However, they did begin to develop Cyprus in limited ways. They began, if you like, with the infrastructure, the road infrastructure. And then in the early part of the 20th century, they redeveloped in a limited way Famagusta Harbour. They built a railway, and they also experimented with reservoirs for agricultural use. So what we begin to see is changes in society. We begin to see life expectancy and health in general improving. Better health conditions leads to an increase in the population. So what we're seeing is a steady increase in the population. The problem was that the economy didn't keep up with that. So one of the critical things in relation to the Mule Corps is the fact that just before the start of the First World War, we begin to see for the first time Cypriots emigrating beyond their usual destinations. The usual destinations being Egypt, probably number one, and other parts of the Middle East. But from around 1912, we begin to see Cypriots moving to Western Europe, but also to North and South America.
Well, this sort of takes us then into the outbreak of the First World War, which is 1914. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Europe in 1914 and the intricacies of all the alliances that led everyone into this inevitable Great War?
Yes. So the immediate cause, or if you like, the catalyst, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, by Serbian nationalists on the 28th of June, 1914. So this precipitates a series of, I suppose, events that leads to the outbreak. However, there are deeper causes that go back, in fact, decades, but one of which is the rivalries between the European powers, very in some cases, deep rivalries, fears of, certain powers over, in relation to other powers, and a whole series of, if you like, crises that predate the start of the war, on which sometimes they come to agreement with, sometimes they don't. But also there's, as you mentioned, the alliances that developed out of these, the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Italian. So on one side, the Italians don't end up joining them in the war. And then on the other side, we have the British, the French, and the Russians. And those alliances were pretty polarizing for Europe. And within those, there's also a sort of subset of rivalries connected to imperialism and, the expansion of the European powers, the scramble for Africa, but also the fact that particularly the later alliances, particularly Britain, France, Russia, within those documents and treaties, there is a recognition of each other's imperial interests. So it's very much part of it's interconnected, the polarization, the alliances, and imperialism. And then there's, of course, domestic political factors as well, which we won't go into detail, as well as an arms race, which is happening between Germany and Britain in particular. So there's a whole series of deeper factors beyond the assassination.
Right. And I mean, at this point in time, we also have this surge of patriotism where we have people just enlisting to support king and country. I mean, and this is especially the case for Great Britain. And before we talk about the Mule Corps, I wanted to kind of wrap my mind around how significant the Cypriot contribution was to the war effort, and the question that kind of I'm trying to better understand is, why enlist? I mean, I understand why the British would enlist, but why did Cypriots enlist? I mean, why was this a surge of patriotism? I mean, how do we better understand this?
So there's a few things to say here. The first thing to say is, I mentioned before that Cypriots were leaving to go abroad. These were opportunities to go work in North and South America and Western Europe. And so the one way we can look at the Cypriot Mule Corps is in this way. When the governor or the High Commissioner was asked to form it, he realized that, well, he had to stop the emigration of Cypriot men of military age. Otherwise, they wouldn't come to serve in the Mule Corps. So that's what he did. He banned emigration of Cypriot men of military age. And that's when with that tap turned off, they realized, well, either we just stay in Cyprus and make do, or we take this opportunity to enlist in the Mule Corps and get a really good wage, better than any wage that they could get in Cyprus. And they were promised, I mean, the other point to make is that they weren't fighting. They were what we call auxiliaries. And the British, in their, efforts to coax them to enlist, made it clear that they would not be in harm's way. Of course, they were in harm's way, as we will get to, but the point was that in the advertising, they made it clear that they wouldn't be. So with that in mind as well, with the money on offer, with the fact that they couldn't go abroad, they really were pushed and pulled in this direction.
So were the majority of volunteers then farmers and laborers, from where were they recruited from primarily?
Well, the people who came forward to these centers that were set up to sign up primarily came from rural areas. And the percentages, based on the statistics that I have in the book, indicate that 57% came from a village with less than 900 inhabitants. So that's quite telling, because the village that I classified as next up, large village from 900 to around 2,000 inhabitants, also had 15%, which was equal to the urban percentage of 15. So the almost 60% came from rural areas, which is quite high and quite telling. And yes, they would have primarily been peasants or rural laborers.
Considering that at this time, I mean, we have wide illiteracy across the island, presumably. I mean, I might be mistaken there.
Yes.
How were they reached? I mean, did they use visuals and pamphlets with, I mean, simple phrases? I mean, how did they reach their recruitment goals in Cyprus?
So yeah, the book talks about the illiteracy, which was very high, and mentions how there were posters and leaflets that were distributed to all parts of the island, and particularly found their way to the local gafenia, the cafes, because inevitably there'd be somebody turning up at some point who was literate and who could read it. In some instances, the British would take interpreters, Greek and Turkish interpreters, to some places, not obviously every place, and they would read the pamphlets out, and then, before leaving them there. But they relied upon people who would inevitably go to the cafe, like probably a teacher or something, to read out the information. And basically, this wasn't a, how can I put it? The advertising was pretty basic, and it was just about how much money they would get. That was a critical element, and promising that they'd look after their families. There was a system whereby funds would be retained from their wage each month and distributed to their families in Cyprus, where they would have to go to the district commissioner's office and they would get their pay, the money. These leaflets and posters would make sure that it was clear that they would not be in harm's way. And initially, they had to actually, it also stated that they were signing a 12-month contract. So there was some controversy with this, because the British didn't interpret this as meaning that it was a 12-month contract and then they could come home. They meant it to be, well, it's initially for 12 months, but if we say so, you're going to continue on. Whereas the Cypriots took it to mean a 12-month contract, and we're coming home afterwards, because it stipulated that they would be freely, they would be transported there and back for free.
Right.
Having said that, many of the Cypriots, so eventually, after some controversy, and a very minor sort of conflict, basically the British decided, oh, never mind, let's just bring them home, those who want to come home after the 12 months. And then what happened was many of them came back for a few weeks and then decided to sign up again. So that's why it was very difficult to work out, how many exactly, because they were many of them signed up for a second time, and therefore they had two numbers.
Is there any way we can quantify how a wage as a muleteer compares to the wage that of a laborer in Cyprus in the early 20th century?
The book looks at this and makes it very plain and clear that the salary that they were given as muleteers was well above what they could have earned in Cyprus. Salaries, for instance, for a rural laborer, depended upon the harvest, and that was inconsistent. It was up and down. It was erratic. But even on a good year, they could not expect to make what they were being offered in the Cypriot Mule Corps. So the salaries that they were getting were around the £3, just over £3 a month, which was exceptional for Cyprus standards. But there were also different categories. There were different roles. There was the basic role of a muleteer, which was to basically drive or steer a mule, which was packed with whatever it may have been, provisions or ammo, or also, of course, injured soldiers. But there was also other roles that Cypriots could do. Some of them were appointed from Cyprus to be foremen, which would take control of a group of muleteers. Others would earn the role and be appointed to the role after having served as a muleteer. They would get, generally speaking, around £1 more than a muleteer. And there was also other roles. There were people who were the shoes for the mules, who also got additional salary. And also there were translators who also were paid more. So there were different roles, although the main job was of a muleteer.
Before we jump into the muleteers and the necessity for mules during the First World War, presumably one of the other, I suppose, selling points is an opportunity to see Europe, or to see the world, so to speak. With that being said, where were Cypriots mostly deployed to?
Yeah, so absolutely, as part of the basic advertising, join up and see the world or see the war was an element of that. But that really just meant Macedonia, northern Greece, southern Bulgaria, maybe part of Serbia there. So in the fighting that was occurring in what was known as the Macedonian front, some of the muleteers, because the muleteers were attached to different units in the British Army. So it really depended on where those units went. The vast majority just stayed in Macedonia, but there were some who were moved elsewhere, such as to Egypt. So we do have examples of Cypriots who had to then go to Egypt. And then once the armistice happened, and shortly thereafter, the Allies occupied Constantinople or Istanbul, the muleteers followed the British units that they were a part of as part of the Allied occupation of Istanbul. So they also served there in a different sort of capacity, because the fighting had finished. But that was also part of their role. And we do know that Cypriots enlisted in the Cypriot Mule Corps after the armistice, and that was one of the things that when I discovered it, I realized that it was difficult to work out how many exactly served, because all I could do was estimate, because the fact that the honor roll only listed the men who had been enlisted during the time of the war in order for them to get the medal. And those who enlisted after the armistice were not part of the honor roll. And I only discovered them through deeper research and working out that there were numbers that went after the armistice, right? So I then realized, well, I don't know who all of these are. I can only know the ones who are listed in some document because of this or the other reason.
Right.
Um,
And I guess you had mentioned that some recruits were recruited for their ability to translate. Again,
mm,
presumably translate between Greek and Turkish, especially considering where they were in northern Greece, where there was at the time a significant Turkish population, and then presumably later on into Istanbul as well. Am I right in inferring that?
it was mainly actually to translate between English and Greek and English and Turkish, so that the British officers and the British more generally could communicate with these muleteers,
Okay.
because because of their lack of English proficiency. That was the main reason.
Let's talk a little bit about the actual Mule Corps, because I mean you mentioned a little bit about its role as an auxiliary force
Yes.
that principally transported goods and in some cases injured soldiers. I suppose this is a two-part question. The first part is why mules? And the other question is, of course, why the Cypriots? Why were
Yes.
Cypriots in particular recruited for this role?
So in 1916, the war for the Allies wasn't going so well after the failure of the Gallipoli landings. Greece was neutral. The king of Greece was married to the sister of the Kaiser, and he wanted Greece to remain neutral, to the point where he had divided the country, um, because he refused to honor a treaty with Serbia to go to war for Serbia in the event that it were attacked. This led to the Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, who was pro British. It led to his resignation, and he eventually established a second government in Salonika, where he allowed the British and French to land forces and to start another front after Gallipoli. And the terrain there was very hilly and mountainous, and therefore they needed mules. So it actually did sort of initially begin with, well, somebody there knew that Cyprus had mules. The mule, I talk about the mule in the book quite a bit, but the mules in Cyprus were known for being hardy and for being better than other mules. Some mules are good for carrying people. Some mules are better at carrying goods, and the Cypriot mule was known for carrying goods. And it was then that they realized, having sent the High Commissioner a note to say, hey, we need mules, can you get us mules? They realized, well, we'll also need people to drive the mules. Now, initially, they hired people from the area. Some would have been Greek, others may have been Slavic in origin. We don't know a lot about them, but we can see some of them in the honor roll. But a lot of the names are missing, or they're corrupted, they're not written properly. But after a while, that dried up, and I think it's because Venizelos wanted all the able-bodied men to serve in the Greek army. So that's when they then turned to the Cypriots to recruit the muleteers from there.
You had mentioned just a moment ago that they were in and around Salonika, Thessaloniki, and they may have seen, I think, action, which I suppose they weren't expecting. Do you mind elaborating on their role on the Salonika front, as I believe it's known as, and
Yes.
how did the Cypriots get involved and see action on that front?
So their main role was to transport goods to and from the front, provisions, food, um, ammunition, weapons, and so forth, but also wounded soldiers and other personnel. And these were mountainous, hilly terrains. It wasn't like there was a good roads. There were mainly dirt roads, roads that weren't properly formed, and so forth. And also the weather was not always good. There were, for instance, reports of snow and blizzards as well at various times of the year. But they were also, going quite close to the fighting. One of their complaints was of shelling around them. They were in harm's way in that respect. But also there was another thing, then that was the diseases that were prevalent that also caused death and of course, sickness.
Do we know how many Cypriots died in the First World War?
There were around 180 odd who died serving as muleteers. I'm not sure if that's a definitive number. At the moment, that's what I know. Mind you, there were Cypriots who served in other armies during the war, not just the British Army. There weren't many. We're not talking the same level as in the British Army, but there were Cypriots who served in the French Army. I don't know the numbers. I do know that there was at least one from memory, perhaps more, that died. I also know that the French had a Greek legion in their army, but I don't know anything about it because nobody's done any research on it, and I'm not sure if, as part of that, there were Cypriots. Now, these people who served in these other armies, whether it's the French or the Greek or the Ottoman, they were individuals who were already in those countries when the war started, or if you like, when the freeze happened to emigration, to facilitate enlistment into the Mule Corps. So they weren't people who were, recruited in Cyprus by these armies or who left Cyprus to go join these armies. They were there already for another reason. So we don't know how many died in that for those other countries' colors, but in the Mule Corps around the 180 mark.
And for those who did return, I mean, we talked earlier about the wages and how lucrative they were.
Mm.
Did they return richer? Were there any who came back and they had were they noticeably more affluent than those that they left behind?
Absolutely. Some who returned, who were diligent with their money, returned with some good money on them. Others also through so it was known as an allotment scheme where, as I mentioned before, a certain amount of your salary was allotted to your family or someone you nominated in Cyprus, and they too would of course benefit. Although in that situation, it was more about not abandoning, a wife and children back in Cyprus, right? So you could go off and do this. And that scheme was quite interesting because it initially was a really bad failure in the sense that it took months for it to get off the ground. And, when you're poor and when you're reliant on your husband, months is too long. And there were a lot of cases of hardship reported and many complaints about the failure to get the allotment scheme started quickly enough. But once it started, it generally speaking worked pretty well.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe I read that the majority of the Mule Corps were Christian. What do you think accounts for the disparity of service? And I know one might assume that perhaps Muslim Cypriots didn't enroll because of their loyalties to the Ottoman Empire. But I think you suggest that that isn't quite accurate. So what do you mean exactly?
Yes. Well, what I'm suggesting is, well, the first thing to say is 90% of the Cypriots who served were Orthodox Christian, and just over 8% were Muslim, and that is significantly under their demographic representation. The census of 1911 had the Orthodox Cypriots at around 78% and the Muslims at 20.5% roughly. So that's significantly under. On the face of it, when you look at it, you think, oh yeah, maybe the Muslims didn't want to enlist because they would have been fighting the Ottomans. Having said that, they were promised in all the advertising that they wouldn't be, that they were fighting in the Bulgarians. That was partly to alleviate, perhaps any concerns that Muslims might have had. There isn't any evidence that the Muslims did not enlist because they felt any deep loyalties to the Ottomans. Some of them may have. But I come up with a different justification, and that is that proportionally speaking, Muslims lived more in urban areas than in rural areas. So if we look at the statistics very carefully, we know that, as I mentioned earlier, 57.5% of those who enlisted came from rural areas, right? A village of less than 900. But Muslims primarily, proportionally speaking, more of them lived in urban areas than in rural areas compared to Orthodox Christians. That was, I think, a more important reason to account for the lower representation.
Are there any significant anecdotes that stand out or come to mind that you would have come across during your research into the Cypriot Mule Corps while they were serving in the Balkans?
Well, most of the information that comes to light are usually when there's trouble. So, for instance, one of the chapters deals with people who were injured, for example. I had to be selective. I gave the stories of a number of muleteers who served. One, for example, that were injured. One, for example, was, perhaps I'll just mention two. One was a guy called Haris Banau, or Banai, from Rizogarpaso in Famagusta. Now, he was disabled. He was one of the few that ended up following his unit to Egypt, where he accidentally fell from a tram car and had his leg amputated from the knee. Now he returned to Cyprus, and he, through his father, but also through the representations of the Archbishop, asked for certain things like an artificial leg, a pension, medical treatment when necessary. Now, the British applied a very sort of strict policy in the sense that they argued that the contracts that the Cypriots signed did not permit for any compensation. In the case of Haris Banau, he didn't get any. It's unclear how he ended up getting an artificial leg. He comes from my in-laws' village, so I know a little bit about him beyond what the archives told me, that he ended up getting an artificial leg, but it's unclear how he ended up getting it. Another example is Agathoklis Haji Christodoulou, and he's a good example because he was the only one who ended up really getting anything from the British, and largely because he persisted in writing to them constantly. Now, he had both his legs broken and amputated as a result of gangrene.
Do we know where the gangrene, where he had the infection, or how he got the infection in the first place? Was it from an accident? This
Well,
wound,
he broke his legs. He broke his legs early in December of 1918, and then he was taken to hospital, and it's there that the gangrene developed, and his legs were amputated early in January of 1919. And he wrote repeatedly to the Cypriot government, petitioning, things like to pay his outstanding wages. Usually they would get their outstanding wages, but they sort of had to pester the authorities about it. But he wanted more. He wanted a pension. He wanted artificial legs. He would refer to the fact that he was crippled for life. Eventually, after a number of petitions, he was authorized a grant of £40, which was a lot of money. But you understand the way that they did it. It was like, here you go, here's £40 and go away, basically. Don't bother us again. Now, the problem was that, you give a guy £40, his eye's going to light up. And so Haji Christodoulou ended up spending the £40, and he then writes again saying, well, I'm penniless again. I need help. He even wrote to Churchill, who would have been the war secretary at the time. He also got assistance to get artificial legs numerous times. Eventually, they also gave him an allowance to help, keep his legs in good repair. Then after, many years and several times they gave him, I think they next gave him £20 5 or 6 years later after the initial 40. Anyway, at length they gave him a job in the forestry department, and they got him to answer the phone. He was a phone operator up in Stavros tis Psokas, up in the middle of nowhere in the mountain areas. And ironically, he also developed a second career as a cobbler. The man with no legs learned to make shoes. After a while, they gave him another offer of £50, but to leave his job. Basically, they said he wasn't up to performing the job. So he was the only one who really received any serious assistance. Of course, there were others who were, impacted. Widows, I talk about them. They weren't given much help. I found this very interesting. Several of the women referred to themselves as orphaned widows, which was an interesting term which I hadn't come across before, but it just reflects how dependent they were on their husbands.
There was a point that was made, that you made, that during the interwar years, the British government did give small sums to Jamaican and Indian volunteers. You pretty much implied that the Cypriots didn't really receive much, if anything at all, notwithstanding these stories that you just shared. Was that simply because it wasn't, there was nothing in the contract that indicated that they would have small sums be granted? What else might account for the disparity in the post-war financial support?
Yeah, basically the British stood firm on the contract that they got them to sign, which stipulated that they wouldn't be compensated if they were injured, and the families wouldn't receive compensation if they died. So,
and sorry to interrupt. And am I to understand then that, say, Indian recruits were granted, like if that was in their contracts, that they would get small sums, or were there different reasons for different parts of the empire getting different post-war settlements?
It depended if you were an auxiliary or whether you were whether you were going to fight. In the Indian context, there were regiments that were to be fighting regiments, but there were also regiments that would be auxiliaries. At the time that I did this book on the Cypriots, there was nothing out there on auxiliaries, out from the empire. I'm not sure in the years since whether anything has been done on the Indian Mule cause. In the case of the Jamaicans, this was a very interesting one. They were initially recruited to fight, but I think from memory, only one regiment or two ended up fighting, and then the British decided against them fighting, and there was a controversy because the Jamaicans wanted to fight and they took offense at being just restricted to auxiliary work. So I'm assuming that in the context of the Jamaicans, they didn't sign any contracts that stipulated that they wouldn't be compensated.
Local newspapers, they didn't really mention the Mule Corps, and it wasn't really represented in popular media for what it's, for whatever that was worth at the time. What explains for the apathy, or maybe not apathy, but just the lack of attention? Why wasn't this like exploited for their own aims?
Yeah, it's interesting that the Cypriot elites, those who were in control of the newspapers, those who were trying to, I suppose, direct the politics of the country, which for most of them revolved around, in the Greek Cypriot context at least, uniting Cyprus to Greece. They didn't pursue the idea that, look, we're going to support you in this war, and in exchange, we want you to give us what we want, which is to unite us to Greece. They didn't take that position, partly because there was a significant support for the Greek monarchy, which wanted, as I mentioned earlier, Greece to remain neutral because the king was married to the sister of the German Kaiser. It's more than that. I mean, he was more Philo-German, right? So basically, there was a significant element of support, at least quiet, I suppose, support for his position. And therefore, they didn't want to pursue anything like this. And also perhaps because they believed, wrongly as it turned out, that because Cyprus was offered to Greece during the war and rejected by the king that most of them liked, right, because it would have meant that Greece had to enter the war on the side of the British immediately, they believed that the British would renew the offer after the war. And that too was a mistaken belief. So those are probably the two reasons why more wasn't made of this politically.
Mm-hmm.
And very little discussion in the newspapers beyond, very minor factual, small, how many went off on this ship, or where the enlistment station was, stuff like that.
I think, I had mentioned to you a couple months ago when we were chatting, I said that I was in Cyprus, and I was talking with my uncle, who I knew vaguely that my grandfather, he had served in the Second World War, except the problem is that and this is my mom's father, he died when my mom was 3, and so not a lot of information was passed down, but we all knew that he served in the Second World War, and I had started chatting with my uncle about it. For what little he knew, most of the information he got from his mom, because of course he was also a young boy, and I asked him in what capacity did my Bapu serve in? And he had said, "Itan mularis." And
Yes.
I was taken aback because I knew about the Mule Corps in the First World War. I wasn't expecting to hear that about the Second World War. Especially considering the advancement in technology, and for whatever reason, I'm not thinking that. I mean, they have vehicles now that'll transport you, from X to Y, that there wouldn't be a need for mules. So I suppose my question is a little bit more of a personal question, which is,
Yes.
uh, did did Cypriots continue to serve in that capacity even in the Second World War?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. When the war broke out, the British began to recruit Cypriots for pack units, as they were known, to drive mules. And they were some of the first, I think they were, in fact, the first colonial forces to serve in the war in France. And it was only later that they formed the Cyprus Regiment, which also primarily consisted of auxiliary roles, but there were also some combatant roles, both before and both before the Cyprus Regiment was formed and within the Cyprus Regiment as well. But primarily, we are talking again about auxiliary roles, and mules and so they needed these pack transport companies, but also there were mechanical companies as well, and they needed them to serve on the Western Front initially, but then they also served in Palestine and in Italy as well, basically because of the lack of transportation, sometimes because of the terrain as well. And yeah, basically there were small units of infantry, but they served in the Battle of France. Then they served in the Battle of Greece. Many, over 500 were captured in Greece. They served in North Africa, and then in the Middle East, and then later in Italy.
And that's
Many
where
left.
they
Yeah.
they tell us that my grandfather was in Italy.
Yes. Yes.
And again, I knew about North Africa, I knew about Egypt, and I know
Yes.
that because of my cousin's grandfather, who also was served in the Second World War. A little side note here: he had told us that he spoke Arabic, and we laughed it off because we said, "Okay, Bapu, no problem. Yeah, I'm sure you
Yeah.
do."
Yeah.
And a Syrian friend of my cousin had happened to be coming by that day, and lo and behold, they started speaking in Arabic to each other, and
Yeah.
it blew our minds. It was
Yes.
incredible. But
Well, it's the same. Others who served in Macedonia picked up Slavic, and for example.
yeah. So that brings me to my last question, Andrico, and that is,
Yeah.
most, and in this, and I include myself in this generalization, are by and large unaware of the Cypriot war effort, especially
Yes.
during the First World War. And I guess my question is, what would you say accounts for this lack of awareness about the Cypriot contribution?
Well, the last chapter of the book goes into this in some detail. The 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 main reasons are that it wasn't conducive to, anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism to emphasize that there was such a significant service of the Cypriots in either war, in either of the world wars. It didn't gel right with, trying to remove the British and unite the country to Greece. It wasn't a story that they wanted to advertise and to broadcast, and it subsequently becomes suppressed within the living memory. And a lot of history is, as you pointed out with yourself, and is given down through family stories. But if people aren't talking about it because they don't want to, or because they don't think they should be, then it doesn't get given down. And many people who I approached, who I mentioned, that when I was working on this project, knew nothing about what I was talking about. And then I would say to them, well, can you tell me the villages of your family? And I look them up on the list, because I put the list of names, so the list of the honor roll, and then all the other names that I ended up discovering, because like I mentioned to you, there were others who enlisted after the armistice. I put them in an Excel file, and with as much detail as I could, and then I could sort them in different ways and work out, like I said, how many had died, how many had absconded, how many came from this village, how many from that place, and so forth and so on. So I was able to tell them, the names of the people from their villages, and then many of them would be surprised to find that there was a relative amongst them.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And that sounds like a really laborious task. I can't imagine that it was very easy to gather all this information.
No, it was very time consuming. The archives, from memory, did send me an Excel list, but it was all over the place and the names were all misspelled. So I had to standardize it. I did get some research assistance at one point, because it was just, I decided that, if I get some funds, I'm going to spend a little bit on this, because it was just so, time consuming to get the list right before I could begin to analyze it. And yeah, but it had to be done. Ultimately, I never finished the list, in the sense that one element that I didn't complete were the dates of enlistment and the date of discharge. Because one of the things that I realized was that Greek and Turkish Cypriots were enlisting and on the same day. They were beginning this on, they would go from certain villages in groups to enlist. So it became obvious that they were going together, because they were signing up on the same days, which I thought was quite interesting. So yeah, basically it's a story that was suppressed from, memory, from historical consciousness. And it was actually really challenging, but, I really enjoyed doing this book, to recreate the story, because the Cypriots didn't leave letters and they didn't leave memoirs. So it was all from the archival record, practically all from the archival record. And it was that the honor roll was particularly useful to build up that statistical, but also that, where they came from and so forth. That was, all through that honor roll.
That's amazing. And it's obviously, it goes without saying, it's some important work that you've done and that you continue to do, Andriko. And for those listening, the book is called Serving the Empire in the Great War, the Cypriot Mule Corps. Andriko, it was awesome having you back again. It was a pleasure talking to you. Every time we chat, I always learn something new that I obviously didn't know before. And it really is a pleasure, Andriko.
And it was my pleasure, and I look forward to us doing it again soon.
Yeah, and what are you working on right now, just before I let you go? Now that you're on your sabbatical.
I'm trying to finish a book on my father's ship to Australia and the journey to Australia. It was the ship was called the Corsica. It had different names because it had become notorious coming to Australia for its bad conditions. And basically, it's the story of Cypriot immigration to Australia. That's the broader context. And even broader than that, Cypriot immigration more generally, particularly to the UK, insofar as it, I've got to situate the Australian story in a broader context. But then I really just sort of focus in on the ship and the people on the ship, because it was the largest number of Cypriots who moved at one time anywhere, ever. There were 760 of them on this ship. Because other vessels that came to Australia were mixed. They were Italians, Maltese, Greeks, Cypriots, Egyptians, Lebanese even, and so forth. But this one was the only one that was basically just consisted of Cypriots. But also it was a very bad trip. The potatoes that were loaded and the other vegetables that were loaded in Cyprus they rotted not that long after leaving, and it just stunk, and they had to get thrown out. They had to spend time in Colombo in Sri Lanka cleaning the ship out, but the stench never really went away. But that was just only one of the issues. There were a whole heap of issues. Yeah. So the book explores this. It explores where these people settled in Australia to give us this geographical spatial understanding, and then the final chapter tells us about a more personal element, and how the journey has been with me in my life, and its importance to Dad's life and the friendships that he had. I forgot to mention an earlier chapter, takes a leaf out of this book that we've been talking about today, in which I look at where they came from in Cyprus as well. And that's been a real challenge, because the list, the passenger list doesn't tell us where they came from. So I've had to go and track down their applications to come to Australia, which has been hell. In fact, initially I thought to myself, I can't do this. Initially I thought this can't happen, because the names were spelt in so many different ways. I couldn't work out who was who. Eventually, after a while, I decided to just go for it. And at the moment I'm sitting on about, I think from memory, about 500 names, 500 out of the 760 that I know where they came from. Based on their applications, cross-checking their ages. So that's the main project that I'm working on.
All right, Andrekos.
Okay.
Have a great afternoon.
You too. All right. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.